Merci. Présentation et débat sur le lancement de la mise en œuvre de la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine, ZLECA. J'invite son Excellence M. Albert M. Muchanga, commissaire du commerce et de l'industrie de l'Union africaine, à faire sa présentation. Commissaire, vous avez la parole.
The Right Honorable Nkodo Dang, President of the Pan-African Parliament, honorable members of the Pan-African Parliament, the Secretary General / Clerk of the Pan-African Parliament, staff of the Pan-African Parliament, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to address the third ordinary session of the 5th Pan-African Parliament on the topic, the launching and implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA. I'd also like to thank the Right Honorable Nkodo Dang, President of the Pan-African Parliament, for his kind invitation to me to address this august House. The Pan-African Parliament is expected to play an even greater role as we progress toward the African Economic Community envisaged in the treaty establishing the African Economic Community, or the Abuja Treaty of 1991, as it is often called. In order to provide you with a comprehensive update on the African Continental Free Trade Area, I have divided my intervention in 4 main parts. I'll start with the launch of the operational phase of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Thereafter, I'll deal with preparations for the start of trading under the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is targeted for the 1st of July 2020. This will be followed with a presentation on Phase 2 negotiations. I'll end by suggesting some roles that could be played by the Pan-African Parliament in the implementation of the agreement establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area, as well as suggest ways and means of the Pan-African Parliament achieving its objective of transforming into a continental legislative assembly. The Right Honorable President of the Pan-African Parliament, honorable members of the Pan-African Parliament, you will recall that during the 32nd ordinary session of the Assembly, held on the 10th and 11th of February 2019 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the African Union Heads of State and Government decided to hold an extraordinary summit in July 2019 in Niamey, Niger. The aim was to celebrate the first anniversary of the signing of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, launch the operational phase of the African Continental Free Trade Area market, and decide on the location and organizational structure of the Secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Accordingly, the African Union Heads of State and Government assembled in Niamey, Niger, on July 7, 2019, for their 12th extraordinary summit. Many people always ask about what was launched in Niamey on 7th July 2019. The launch of the operational phase of the African Continental Free Trade Area in Niamey consisted of the unveiling and launching 5 key operational instruments that are vital for the effective and successful implementation of the agreement establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area. These are the African Continental Free Trade Area Rules of Origin, online negotiation password-protected portal, which will result in a schedule of concessions in trade in goods, Pan-African Payments and Settlements System, Continental Online Mechanism for monitoring, reporting, and elimination of non-tariff barriers, and dashboard of the African Trade Observatory. Let me now say a few words on each of these instruments. The African Continental Free Trade Rules of Origin are one of the most important pillars of the trade agreement. They will determine whether or not goods will be eligible for preferential treatment in the African Continental Free Trade Area market. They are, in a sense, a passport that helps determine the goods that are tax-free under the rules of the African Continental Free Trade Area. This means that products will not qualify as originating within the African Continental Free Trade Area market, and if they do not qualify, they will continue attracting duties. It is important to note that an appropriate administration of the African Continental Free Trade Area Rules of Origin by customs officials is very critical. This is because it has the potential to stimulate the development and sustainability of regional and continental value chains. Africa needs this in order to promote economic diversification and structural transformation, as well as make our economies more competitive. With effective implementation of rules of origin, our industrialization will develop very rapidly. In this respect, there will be strict implementation of the rules of origin in order to ensure that there are no transshipments of goods from third parties. Such transshipments or trade deflation can undermine both the African Continental Free Trade Area market and our drive for industrialization. The second instrument is the African Continental Free Trade Area online negotiating password-protected portal. This is an online tool accessible to all state parties, which will assist them in their negotiations. The tool will consist of a collaborative platform to exchange the list of products defined at the tariff level line, as well as the tariffs that could be applied. The offers will only be shared through the system upon approval by a member state or state party. The platform will also provide a tool suggesting product lists as well as potential starting points for negotiation, taking into account the variables such as tariff revenue and export potential of a given state party. Furthermore, the portal will be the repository for most favored nation tariffs and the non-sensitive tariffs, which is 90%. Ultimately, the portal will have minimum information on all tariff lines, that is 100%. The output of this portal will be a schedule of tariff concessions in trade in goods. The third instrument is the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System. This is being developed by the African Export and Import Bank or Afrexim Bank. It is the first dedicated continental system to connect the processing, clearing, and settlement of intra-African trade and commercial payments. This is an innovative tool that will help address one of the main constraints affecting intra-African trade, which is the existence of several currencies across Africa, the majority of which are non-convertible. The Pan-African Payments and Settlement System will interconnect all actors in the payments landscape with the purpose of accelerating trade as well as interconnecting central banks, financial services providers, businesses, and end users to address market challenges. As a digital platform, it will also enable us to capture informal cross-border trade and in the process, raise the level of intra-African trade by a minimum of 15%. Furthermore, the African Export-Import Bank estimates that the system will save the African continent about $5 billion annually in transaction costs. The third instrument is the online African Continental Free Trade Area non-tariff barriers reporting, monitoring, and elimination mechanism. The mechanism will allow for confidential exchange of information among the state parties aimed at monitoring and resolving trade concerns that relate to restrictive regulations and procedures. Other than tariffs, these make importation or exportation of products both difficult and costly. Through this mechanism, which will have features and facilities for web-based and short messaging service, or SMS reporting, a state party or an economic operator may register a complaint or trade concern regarding a non-tariff barrier. Non-tariff barrier notifications will be received by the focal points of the reporting country, the responding country, and the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat for processing. Summaries of reported non-tariff barriers and status of their resolution would be accessible through the online site. This is a very important tool because non-tariff barriers are sometimes more prevalent than tariffs in restricting trade. Consequently, the mechanism will enhance transparency and provide for ease follow-up on progress in the resolution of reported and identified non-tariff barriers. Disputes that are not resolved will go to a dispute settlement process. Our hope is for a resolution of all non-tariff barriers before they are taken to the dispute settlement process. The fifth and last instrument is the dashboard of the African Trade Observatory. The African Trade Observatory will be an online platform providing reliable and up-to-date qualitative and quantitative trade information, as well as data to support evidence-based policy and business decisions. The African Trade Observatory dashboard will have two main modules. There will be a public module called Explore, which will be accessible to the general public with information on business opportunities, market access conditions, as well as applied regulations, including non-tariff measures. In addition, There will also be a directory of genuine and registered exporters and importers, as well as authorized economic operators. The African Trade Observatory will also have a restricted module called Monitor, with advanced features for monitoring of the implementation and impact of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. The African Trade Observatory will be supported by a data quality and information transfer system comprising of a network of national and regional data providers. An African Trade Observatory unit housed within the African Union Commission Department of Trade and Industry, and an advisory board chaired by the African Union Commission. 28 countries and 6 of the 8 regional economic communities recognized by the African Union have already designated their focal points, who work with the African Union Commission to establish the African Trade Observatory. All data in the African Trade Observatory system will be owned by state parties. Another instrument that will support operation of the agreement establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area will be specific commitments in trade in services, since services now constitute a growing component of international trade. 5 priority sectors have so far been agreed upon, and these are financial services, business services, tourism, transport, and communications. Remaining work on all these instruments is expected to be concluded earlier or by 1st July 2020, when the market starts operating. The Right Honorable President of the Pan-African Parliament, honorable members of the Pan-African Parliament, let me, at this stage, dwell on other key decisions on the operationalization of the African Continental Free Trade Area.
Translation. Spanish translation. Español, por favor.
Okay, sorry. In addition to launching the key operational instruments of the African Continental Free Trade Area, the African Union heads of state and government also took 6 key decisions which are critical for the effective operationalization of the African Continental Free Trade Area. The first one is on the start of trading under the African Continental Free Trade Area. In connection with this, the heads of state and government decided that dismantling of tariffs will start no later than 1st July 2020. I was saying the first one is on the start of trading under the African Continental Free Trade Area. In connection with this, the heads of state and government decided that dismantling of tariffs shall start no later than 1st of July 2020 to allow for the start of trading in the African Continental Free Trade Area market on the same day. This means that the African private sector needs to get ready to produce to the scale of the market, as well as expand logistics facilities to cater for this large market. For some business people, there may be need to form joint ventures or partnerships in order to mobilize the resources necessary to supply the new domestic market for Africa. The second summit decision was that the final schedule of tariff concessions, outstanding work on rules of origin, and specific commitments in trading services must be submitted to the next session of the Assembly of the African Union in February 2020. The schedules are matrices providing specific information on the list of goods which will be tax-free under the African Continental Free Trade Area, and most importantly, the applicable date. This means that to find out which goods will be tax-free come 1st July 2020, one, we have to look at the schedule of tariff concessions, which are expected to be gazetted in the state parties. Similarly, to know the specific commitments that countries will have made with respect to trade in services, one, we have to go through their respective schedule of specific commitments that will also be gazetted. The third summit decision was that the African Union Commission, as the interim secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade Area, shall organize the inaugural meeting of the African Council of Ministers, African Continental Free Trade Area Council of Ministers, no later than 31st October 2019. Invitations have been sent to state parties to the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. African Union members that have not yet ratified the agreement will attend the meeting as observers if the state parties decide in this direction. However, the best option for these countries is to depose instruments of ratification before the inaugural meeting of the Council of Ministers of Trade. In this way, they will have a seat and voice at that inaugural meeting. The fourth key decision of the summit is that the Commission should ensure that the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat is operational no later than 31st March 2020. A team of officials from the African Union Commission visited Accra, Ghana in August 2019 to discuss a number of issues with the host government, including conclusion of the hosting agreement. The fifth key decision of the summit was to direct the African Union Commission as interim secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade Area to develop a framework of collaboration with regional economic communities aimed at, among others, facilitating efficient flow of goods and services during the operation of the African Continental Free Trade Area market. The framework of collaboration is being developed and targeted to be submitted to the regional economic communities during this month as a basis for consultations with them on it. The sixth key decision of the 12th Extraordinary Summit was the designation of 7th July of each year as Africa Integration Day, without being a public holiday. This will be used to commemorate the operationalization of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. This decision will also help in creating collective memory on the African Continental Free Trade Area, as well as help in popularizing the African Continental Free Trade Area among ordinary Africans. The Right Honorable President of the Pan-African Parliament, or members of Parliament of the Pan-African Parliament, let me at this stage turn to the issue of preparations for the start of trading under the African Continental Free Trade Area on the 1st of July 2020. Some of the preparations have been presented in earlier parts of my statement. I will, therefore, dwell on other issues not already covered. Among those not presented is the requirement for all state parties to start producing trade documents based on templates in the annexes to the Protocol on Trade in Goods. These are to be distributed to all cross-border trade posts. In addition, State parties are required to sensitize their respective business communities on the opportunities offered by the African Continental Free Trade Area. Another key element of preparations is to work with the private sector on the development of productive capacities. This is because market access alone is not enough. We need to supply the new market with quality goods that are also competitively priced. In this connection, we need to scale up manufacturing as a strategic sector in increasing levels of intra-African trade, in addition to facilitating structural transformation, productivity, competitiveness, and innovation. Work is underway in developing productive capacities, and this includes implementation of the small and medium enterprises strategy adopted by the African Union Assembly last year, adoption of a commodity strategy aimed at enhancing value addition, promotion of startups for Africa to harness the potential offered by digital trade and the digital economy, development of African fashion, which is currently estimated at $15 billion annually, as well as pharmaceutical, cassava, and automotive value chains, among others. There is also ongoing sensitization of the African private sector and other potential investors, such as the African diaspora and business houses coming from outside Africa, but operating on the continent. And this sensitization is at the continental level. All these stakeholders are being sensitized on the opportunities that the huge and growing market offers to them, with the expectation that they will respond through increased investments. Following the successful convening of the inaugural Business Forum of the African Continental Free Trade Area, or in 2018, we have organized the second one this year in Niamey, Niger, and this was on 5th July 2019. The forum provided a platform through which African heads of state and government, African ministers responsible for trade and investment and industry, African business leaders, and business member organizations met to discuss and reflect on the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. There was, in this forum, a special focus on developing capacities at the corporate level to supply the African Continental Free Trade Area market to scale. In addition, we are also working with the various organized African private sector associations, such as the Pan-African Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the Regional Councils, Pan-African Private Sector Trade and Investment Policy Committee, PAFTRAC, and the Afro Champions, among others, to establish the African Business Council. These players will be meeting in Addis Ababa during the Africa Industrialization Week, to be held from 18 to 22nd November 2019, to start the discussions on this very important topic. After this, it is envisaged that a committee from among members of the African private sector will be set up to come up with a draft legal framework within a period of 1 year, after which the entire private sector will adopt it. As part of providing a platform for trade information and business-to-business transactions, we are collaborating with the African Export-Import Bank on the biannual Intra-African Trade Fair editions. Following the successful inaugural Intra-African Trade Fair held in Cairo, Egypt in December last year, which was attended by some of you present in this August House, we are now preparing for the second edition, which is scheduled for 1 to 7 September 2020 in Kigali, Rwanda. It is expected that the 2020 edition of the Intra-African Trade Fair, which will take place 1 month after trade has commenced under the African Continental Free Trade Area, will attract more than 1,100 exhibitors from within and outside Africa, draw 4,000 buyers and sellers, more than 70,000 visitors, and generate in excess of $4 billion in trade deals. We will also be working on the popularization of the African Continental Free Trade Area to the private sector and general public through a web-based and mobile-based application for business, which is under development. The application will work as a one-stop shop on access to information on the African Continental Free Trade Area. It will in this respect serve as an electronic African Continental Free Trade Area handbook for business. As an electronic tool, this will make it more accessible to a large audience. This would not have been the case if it was a booklet. We are also giving special attention to the informal sector, which accounts for 80% of employment opportunities in Africa. According to the African Export-Import Bank, informal trade across Africa is annually above $60 billion, representing nearly 1/3 of intra-African trade. With this in mind, the African Union Commission will enhance its collaboration with the regional economic communities to implement the simplified trade regime in order to cater for the needs of small to medium cross-border traders. A study is also underway aimed at mainstreaming the informal cross-border traders in intra-African trade. The Honorable President of the Pan-African Parliament, honorable members of the Pan-African Parliament, let me now turn to phase 2 negotiations. These will focus on negotiation of protocols on investment, competition policy, and intellectual property rights. We expect that negotiations will commence before the end of this year. The tentative deadline for completion of the negotiations is December 2020. The African Union Commission is currently working on recruiting experts to initially support the member states in capacity building before the start of actual negotiations. These 3 protocols, along with the protocol to the treaty establishing the African Economic Community relating to free movement of people, right of establishment, and right of residence, will form the basis for the establishment of the African Common Market. This development should be of interest to this august House because we will then be in a position to move towards an African single market whose operation and strengthening will require continental legislation. It is when we have achieved this that it would be substantively possible to make the Pan-African Parliament become a legislative assembly, as is the case with the European Union. The Right Honorable President of the Pan-African Parliament, honorable members of the Pan-African Parliament, as I conclude my statement, I would like to make some suggestions on the roles that the Pan-African Parliament would play in the implementation of the agreement establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area and issues going beyond that. First and foremost, I suggest that you play a vanguard role in advocating for ratification of the agreement establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area by all African Union member states by 1st July 2020. With such an achievement, we shall start the process of transforming Africa from a conglomeration of small and fragmented markets to one integrated market. The vision of the African Continental Free Trade Area is to create one African market. With this vision, we aim for total defragmentation of Africa in economic terms. We are currently left with one signature and 27 ratifications before we hit the target of 55 signatures and ratifications. With your support, we should be able to attain this target. With the launch of the operational phase of the African Continental Free Trade Area, there will also be need for supportive legislation at national levels in order to ensure that trade takes place smoothly under the African Continental Free Trade Area. In some instances, new laws will have to be enacted. Considering the influence that all of you in your respective national assemblies, I request you, honorable members of the Pan-African Parliament, to ensure that the existing national frameworks are aligned with the African Continental Free Trade Area trading regime in order to support effective implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. I indicated earlier that it is the interest of this august House to transform into a continental legislative assembly once we start the process of establishing the African single market. In this connection, I suggest you lobby the executive wings of your respective governments to move towards this transition with minimum delay. The single market will also enable Africa remove the problem of transshipment of goods from third parties in intra-African trade. To keep the vision of creating a legislative Pan-African Parliament, I also suggest that you annually commemorate African Integration Day on 7th July of each year with workshops, drawing participation from yourselves, representatives of secretariats of the regional economic communities and the secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade Area, as well as representatives of the African Union Commission. These annual commemorations would enable you to take stock of progress towards the creation of an African single market and the Legislative Assembly of the Pan-African Parliament. The Right Honorable President of the Pan-African Parliament, or members of the Pan-African Parliament, other than the fact that the African Continental Free Trade Area is a flagship project of Agenda 2063, it is also, so far, the most ambitious initiative that our organization has undertaken. Through the African Continental Free Trade Area, Africans have challenged themselves to aim higher. This bold and ambitious undertaking requires equally strong commitment to implement the agreement and generate tangible results that benefit ordinary Africans. As leaders and representatives of the African people, you can also make contributions in the implementation of this agreement through the national committees on the African Continental Free Trade Area which exist in each country. I therefore urge you to ensure that we fully implement this historic agreement. I'm sure you all want to be part of this historic undertaking. I will conclude my statement with this call to action. In this historic endeavor, failure is not an option. The only option is success. We owe it to ourselves and future generations in ensuring successful implementation of the agreement establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area. I apologize for the long statement, but I end here and thank you for your kind attention.